Welcome to this new podcast on KnochCast. I don't know where it will be published, if it will be on YouTube, if it's just going to be on SoundCloud. That is something that I'm not sure yet, and I think it will be on both platforms, and it will be able to maybe be seen with webcam if I get that stuff set up somehow, because I had to admit my slight struggles with doing that. What to expect from this series is not that easy to answer. First of all, it was the idea of doing a kind of podcast because of the coronavirus and talking about some philosophical perspectives. And there will be an episode on philosophical perspective in terms of coronavirus severity deniers and how they are, while speaking out for liberal values, disregard liberal values at the same time. That will be an episode on John Stuart Mill. And it might be that in some future episode we will have some guests with whom we will discuss several subjects regarding general topics. At the moment, maybe coronavirus, but in the future, maybe some broader perspectives on the world and on philosophy and maybe psychological questions. Obviously, I am not a trained psychologist, so in that regard, that would be an episode with someone who has more clue about what they are talking about than me, because obviously I cannot speak in that realm. As well as if one would be talking about some medical conditions or medical implications of coronavirus, I would not be able to do this kind of stuff. However, I have a background in social science, so I want to use this one in order to talk about a question that came to my mind yesterday night when I was discussing with a friend, and I was saying, hey, there are problems regarding scientific research that are pretended to be done by people who deny coronavirus. And I think it is kind of important to illustrate what mistakes are commonly made and what I think is very bad about people who try to do research. And I say research because actually in a specific way, in a specific connotation, because I think they are not really doing proper scientific research. And I want to go into what I mean by that. So, in social science, when I would write an article, I would go and look at the data. In most cases, when you do research, you might have you might have had information about it before, but in many cases I found, at least for myself, that I'm reading the articles, I'm reading the information that is published before, and I use data that is published. I use studies that are published, and then I will use that information that I gathered through this process of reading and getting familiar with the data, and then I will make a conclusion based on that. That's how I will do it. There might be people who do it differently, but I think there is something inherently wrong if you go in the research with a preoccupied mind and you look for something that is proving what you're saying. That, in my opinion, is not research. And that is the problem I have with several people online that are saying that the coronavirus is not as bad as a flu, or is not worse than a flu. It is worse than a flu. And there are indications for that I just want to mention here very quickly. One indication that it is worse than the flu is that we see that definitely there are regions in Spain and in the US in which there are more people dying there are reports of statistical offices, like for example, I think the German one also had something like that, which was saying, hey, we have a significantly higher death rate. At least you can read the reports. So there is that you have statistically a higher death rate. But I don't want to even go into that argument here. What I want to say though is that you see that a common flu, even if it's a hard flu, does not lead to overcrowded hospitals. Not really. We don't have the reportings of overcrowded hospitals every year. If it was not as bad, or if it was not worse than a flu, why would we have overcrowded hospitals? Then, in the German conversation, you would have people say, hey, we don't have overcrowded hospitals, and Sweden doesn't have overcrowded hospitals. That is true in Germany, in parts because, yes, the German welfare system is better than many European competitors. And in Germany, you had a lockdown very early. Would Germany have escalated? Yeah, I mean, let's see it like that. We had about 60% people, 60% of the intensive care beds were in use on the peak or something. 60%. But on that, we have to say that we highly increased the number of care beds. So you don't have to take the number. If you compare, you have to take the number of the care bed or the beds, high intensive care beds, and you have to compare. Okay, that number is what we usually have. Is the peak, even though we increased it, and even though we just had 60%, it's still the 60% is of a higher number than before. So is it that if you have twice, okay, let's say you have twice as many intensive care beds, that means you have 10% more people than you would originally have been able to treat. Hence, if that is the case, you would have the problem that, yes, we were overcrowded in a normal condition, but we haven't been because of that, and we haven't been because of the lockdown. But that is a different discussion. What I want to say as well is that the death rate of the coronavirus is about minimum, it's in a span, okay, it's not as clear yet because it's not over, but it's between about 0.3 to 2 or something. And it's obviously probably not 2. It will be around 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, something like that. That is what at least experts say is reasonable to assume. That it's more than 1 is not that likely. But still, even if it's 0.3, it's 3 times more deadly than the flu. 3 times more. It's 300% deadlier than the flu. And of course, when we have the flu, we don't take measures to protect the life of people, and so on. And that is also special because it's a new sickness, and so on and so forth. So what concerns me when I look on the internet and when I look at people making research, there are several problems at play. One problem that is at play is that, as mentioned, people who think that coronavirus is a hoax, they don't read the data. Usually those people are not those who look at the data and make an opinion based on that. Those people usually probably have the opinion, hey, that's a hoax, that's not as serious, and I will prove you that by researching it, and I will prove you that I'm right. That is, I think, in most cases how people are doing it. There might have been people who have gotten research and made their opinion like that. But I think those people who are gathering the data predominantly are not part of that group. And that is the first problem here, that if you go into research with a preoccupied mind and say, oh, I research and I prove that what I think is right, that's not how research works. That's not how science works. And the problem is, so that's obviously bias. You're going biased in your research. If you would do that, you would get criticized by scientists. And that's why those people get criticized. And what I find very particularly interesting about those people is they don't accept the critique on their measures. For example, I have seen a guy comparing different years. So the year 2002 and the year 2020. And he was comparing the total deaths in 2002 and the total deaths in 2020, but using the week 1, 2, 3 in 2002, 2000 and 2020, they use week 15, 16, 20 or something. So you see, if I would write that article and I would compare like that, I would write in my article that there are some limitations for my conclusions. One limitation I would acknowledge is, yes, I'm comparing different weeks. That can be a reason. That can explain why there is a different amount of deaf people. Then I can say, oh, coronavirus is not over yet. We can't make a definitive statement until we have seen the end or the vaccine. Then it is a different year, and maybe we have a different or better healthcare system, or maybe there have been advantages, or maybe the treatment of the flu had more, for example, because that's what they are aiming at. The treatment of the flu is better in or is trained. We know how to deal with the flu. We have a lot of research on the flu, and we don't have a lot of research on coronavirus. Not yet, and that means we can't really know how to treat it best. We have a antivirus treatment for the flu and so on and so forth. So there are so many limitations that a good article would acknowledge and say, hey, there is this stuff, and that is the limitations this study has. So there was this one guy who was comparing it, and people were saying, hey, you're comparing the wrong weeks. And he was saying, not acknowledging that the other person is right, he was just mentioning, or she, I don't know, was just mentioning, but I'm comparing the peak back then and I'm comparing the peak now. And as we can see, there is more in that year than here. That means coronavirus is not as bad. He fails to address, because in that numbers it shows the deaths in 2000 seem to be higher than now. So there are a lot of limitations. Then the question is asked, why would the deaths be less now? Is the healthcare system better maybe? I mean, should not it be exactly the same at least? Or what? But that's not what the person is aiming at. The person is aiming to say, okay, there was a year, there was more deaths than now. Why are there more deaths? Is it because the flu was so bad? Or is it because we have not been able to treat other people? There are so many things that have to be considered in this kind of research and in this kind of publishing one owns collected data that one must be aware of. And that person is not aware of that. The person is disregarding all the counter arguments that everyone who knows what they're talking about would bring to them. And if they were seriously considering publishing data and believing in science, they would be as trained to know, oh yeah, that you're right, there are limitations to my data and I should be aware of that. So that is one big problem that we have in the current situation, that people who do this kind of stuff, who find research to prove their points, they are acting biased and they don't seem to be trained at university level. If they have been trained in university level, I would be highly concerned about the university they have been and about the university education they received. Or maybe not as much if the university education left them with very bad marks on their work. Because I find that is highly questionable, and it seems that those people, based on that, if they are acting like that, and if you, listener, realize something like that, and they are not able to know or speak about limitations of the data, you will realize that they probably don't have good education when it comes to going on with research. That's what I would in that kind of perspective say. And that is a problem, obviously, because they pretend, or they give you the feeling as if they have the information, they have the data. But data is obviously always a bit complicated. So if I make a research, I can put, so for example, everyone knows it. If you do research on something and you want to know something, then you get like, okay, you have an opinion and you do the research, and then you're like, oh, what is in the research is actually completely different to what I found out. And then you are going like, okay, that's totally different. And then you want to find reasons. Okay, why is it so different to what I expected? And then you try to explain why you think it can be different. And yeah, everyone has been there. Everyone, maybe not, probably not everyone, but many will be able to familiarize themselves with that information if they have done proper research before. I think at least they could understand it, the feeling. I would feel so. But yeah, what I was about to mention before is that there is a situation going on that is kind of bad for people who are not too familiar with the situation. Because people find this data, they don't give you sources, which is in a very unscientific way. Of course, you should reference your stuff. Yes, on Twitter it is very unlikely, and on Twitter you make your data, you have those photos, you make your graphs, and you share them. At least that's what I realize online, that people are sharing the graphs, they are doing it. And Twitter is not a good source for that. There are better sources like people on YouTube who can more easily reference what they found. It's because it's very important to know where you got your information so that people can check what your information is. Maybe you're just making it up. There might be people, and there probably are people that make stuff up. But then I also find, when it comes to bias, what the problem about it is when we consider I'm researching in order to prove my point is right. That is the point where those people are coming from. And the problem about that point, is that they will tend to misinterpret research. Because if I read an article about virology, I did not study virology. I didn't study medicine. Do I really completely interpret a article on medicine correctly? Will I be able to completely understand and know the limitations of the work? And will I be able... No, I don't think that I can completely good judge and interpret the work that is done by virologists, if it is good or bad work. Will I be really able to look at that? Probably not as much, because I am not trained in that field. I don't have the background knowledge, and might not be able to see, okay, he's doing that, and it sounds professional, but actually what he's saying is bullshit, what other people would say. So those people obviously don't, people who deny that coronavirus is bad, mostly, I mean, they will tend to have people, very little amount of people, that say, hey, coronavirus is a hoax, that's fine. And there are doctors who say that and who give that impression, which is totally unreasonable and probably not the consensus, because those people who are experts on the field of virology, they are saying that it is highly concerning and that it is more deadly than the flu, and that it's significantly more deadly than the flu. And they will misinterpret what those people are saying. They will misinterpret it, obviously, and they will intentionally misinterpret it. So, for example, when one virologist says, yeah, we won't see a significantly higher death rate, then they will misinterpret it as, oh, it's not as deadly. Even though the context might be that this person speaks, hey, we are in a situation that we have a lockdown, which means we are limiting the amounts of people. Hence, we won't significantly have higher death rate. that is not because the virus is not dangerous. It is because you took measures in order to compare it, and so on and so forth. Then they would find research to the people. I mean, they would find research that is in their interest. So they will maybe. So, for example, when we think about climate change, 99% of the science says, about 99%, maybe it's 98 or something, but it is something like that. Percent of the publications say the humans have impact on the climate. Okay? That is what the consensus in science says. And then you have those people who deny climate change and the human responsibility for it will go with this 1-2 people who said no, but here we have the studies and they say that we are not responsible for it, and they will publish that. They won't regard the other studies. They will say the other studies are false and they are wrong, and that is the only truth, and that is highly unscientific. So it's very selective, and in that the purpose is not to be neutral and taking the facts seriously. It's just to have your own propaganda and publishing your propaganda by validating it with sources that are maybe credible but misinterpreted, or by using sources that are not what the consensus in science says. And yes, the consensus in science is not always correct. But there is a consensus in science of 99 or 98% of the people who say, hey, climate change is caused by humans, and that's significant. And there are people that say that vaccines are helping more than they harm you. And there is the consensus in medicine. And usually you will find people criticizing it, and maybe also doctors, that are in not a science-based way of medicine, but more in alternative medicine. And maybe they have other interests in that. And yes, I don't think that the pharma lobby is doing everything the right way, and that they are the angels, and that they want the good for all people. They are companies that want profit, of course. But are they going to have a huge conspiracy building up and building a virus in order to sell the medicine that we don't even have? I mean, in that case, Gilead must have been doing it, because they are having remdesivir, and that's so far one of the few proven working medicines, I feel or think. But don't hold me accountable to that, as said, since I'm not an expert in that field. And you should talk to credible experts. And it is interesting that credible experts say, hey, you should learn from South Korea, or you should learn from Germany. And that is interesting if international experts say that. And you have also credible experts. Okay, then there's another thing which just comes to my mind in that area. So when we are talking about experts, so yes, there are virologists and there are doctors. There are doctors that are not agreeing with what Drosten in Berlin is saying. He is a credible expert on coronaviruses, especially on coronaviruses. He is researching in that field. He is a professor in that field. He's reading a lot of literature in that field. And he is very differentiating what he is reading and explaining it so that everyone can understand it. And what I realized in that time, and I think he said it in his podcast, is that just because virologists are putting the message forward, just because they tell you what's going on and you are scared about what's going on, you threaten them to kill them as if they were part of a conspiracy. It is not their fault that they tell you what is fact. They just say what is research. They just say what there is. And you can't blame them for the fact that we have a coronavirus. It's not their fault. They didn't create it. And there was research, and they said, yes, coronavirus is not engineered by humans. You can prove that if you look at the I think in coronavirus it's RNA of the virus, and then you see, yes, that's probably not engineered. You can look at that. That's unlikely, and so on and so forth. So there is so much stuff going on online that is so not scientific. And what this podcast and this episode, what I want you to take with you, is just to think about what information do I see online? What intentions might the person have who is transferring that data? And can I read and prove, can he prove the data to me? That's the next thing. And then, is the person who is publishing the data differentiating? Is the person open for criticism about the data they themselves collected? Or is that person protecting the data at any cost, not considering limitations that there are? And an easy way you can see that someone is not acknowledging their own faults in the research or problems about the research is when someone criticizes them, as in that one example I brought about the death data in Sweden or any other country. And then you go, so you have the data, and then they say, okay, someone criticizes that there are different weeks, and then the other person says, yes, okay, but that's the peak. And so far we had the peak here. Yes, okay. The interesting thing is the death data in Sweden. I mean, is the death data in Sweden really that accurate? Can you actually get the 2020 data generally? I mean, that's a different question here. Can you actually get that data already? Or is it as at the end of the year? Usually those statistic data is published at the end of the year, but maybe they have a database where you can see monthly death rate. That might be. But does the normal person have access to it? Maybe, maybe not. And might be that those organizations who do the statistics are publishing it because of public interest. And they might usually not do it. But it's interesting. Just to get back to that one thing about December or winter and comparing it with summer. It is that in winter you have the flu. And in summer you don't really have the flu. So comparing that, you're comparing basically a season without flu where the death rate is lower. So in summer, less people are dying than in the winter. You compare that and then you say, hey, that's the peak. Yes, maybe that might be the peak of this year, but you're completely disregarding that there is a flu factor going on, and so on and so forth. So it is, even though the number of people dying is, okay, that's might be another thought for you to consider. Even if the number of people dying right now is less than in the last week of 2000, and it's now lower, that doesn't mean that in winter we won't have way more people at the same time. We will have way more deaths than now. So because there is the seasonality factor, that's also important to consider when you think about the coronavirus. In summer, people go outside, they're not staying inside. Inside, it's way easier to infect yourself than if you're outside because of the wind and the aerosols and, that kind of stuff. So there are so much things to consider in that whole discussion here. And all that podcast wanted to do is give you a small hint of what to consider when you are encountering those arguments and how to realize if what those people are saying is actually trustworthy or not. And I hope that episode was actually helping on that, and it's already almost 30 minutes, so I will make it short and I will end it here. And in the next episode we will probably talk about John Stuart Mill's harm principle and how liberalism is misused in order to get one's own preference, but actually one acts in a very unliberal way when using liberal in order to do or to get something done which is harming other people. But I will go more into detail what I mean by that in the next episode of this podcast, and I wish you that you stay healthy, that you hopefully protect other people. Don't infect other people on purpose. Please care about what people are saying, what medical authorities are telling you. Don't meet unnecessarily. And please, if you can, wear masks, not because they protect you, but because you protect others.